This week, I'm going to go over qualitative data analysis and specifically how qualitative researchers go about doing case selection and presentation of data uh, in any qualitative article that you read. So, in qualitative research, you collected a load of interviews, you did a bunch of video observations, or you got a bunch of open-ended responses on a survey. Not all of that can go in the paper, at least not as transcripts and quotes. If you did that, you would have a 300-page article potentially, and we don't do that in research. So how do you figure out how to take all of that data and condense it down? Because if you think about quantitative research, where we have a bunch of scores, we usually can more or less present all of our data in terms of the statistics that we end up calculating. It is using all of the data. But we don't do statistics in qualitative research. So how do we go about selecting our data? As you may guess, the question that we keep coming back to across the semester, well, we have two. One of them being, what are your research goals? Because these, or if you have one, that goal is going to drive what you need to do both for data collection and your goals in data analysis too, because whatever you're doing in analysis should meet your overarching research goal. Your theoretical framework may also influence this too, because it again is going to drive decisions that you make regarding data collection and analysis as well. But really, there isn't necessarily one right way to do this because it depends on the approach that you're taking, both intellectually and methods-wise. So for context, I'm going to use my master's thesis, so the article that we read at the beginning of the semester as our first reading. I'm going to essentially talk about how I made my decisions for that article, because when it comes to research, while ideally they tell us as much as they can in their methods section, not every single individual decision is going into it, so I can't speak to why researchers make particular decisions, especially when it comes to really nuanced things that they may not have actually discussed in the paper. So I'm going to use myself as an example because I know why I made the decisions I made, and then you can extrapolate from my example into what we've read this semester and the future readings that you'll encounter as you do more digging into your research on your own. So starting off, because it has been a while since we've read that article, I'm going to focus mainly on methods, but also a little bit of my analysis is going to come into this too. So, as a refresher, I collected 16 hours of interviews from 6 people. So, you could imagine if I took all of those transcripts, it would be, I don't know, 60 or 70 pages straight of transcripts. I can't put that in my article. So, immediately I have to make decisions about what I am going to be taking from these interviews and eventually showing as my results. And just if you were confused, I did not put this table in my article. This is actually from my thesis, but this is kind of the breakdown of how many interviews a person did, because I did multiple interviews with everybody except one person. It was conveyed to my participants as you can do as many as you want, technically. The most I had was 4 from Julia, but for the most part, at least 2 to 3 interviews across everybody. So that's a lot of data to be working with, even though I only interviewed 6 people. When I did analysis, I analyzed all of it. So I did not go through doing selection of my data before I did analysis. And this is generally common across a lot of qualitative research, is selection of what you see that ends up in the research article happens at the very end, basically. So I analyzed all of it so I could do my code development and then coding once I've developed my codes. So all of my transcripts from all of my interviews have codes. They were used in the development of the codes. So if I went to any of my participants' interviews, I would see codes all throughout that. So all of the data was analyzed. But obviously, I didn't present all of that in my article, or even my thesis for that matter. My thesis was way bigger than my article because I had more space, but still didn't present every single transcript that I had from all of my interviews. That wasn't necessary, and we don't have to do that in qualitative research. So How did I do that selection? Well, my goals for what I wanted to do with this project, and also my goals for what I wanted to present to readers, drove how I chose what data I used in my article. So I had two goals. One, I wanted to identify those knowledge resources that students use when they interacted with anomalous data. And then two, I wanted to showcase how those resources interact during this process. So there are two different goals, and generally speaking, they capture two common ways that we present data in qualitative research articles. So I'm going to talk about each of them individually. So starting with that first one, that I wanted to identify knowledge resources students use when they're interacting with anomalous data. So when it comes to things like identification, whether it's themes, or in my case, the knowledge resources, it's common to use tables and figures to give those frequencies, because often frequency of how often these codes or themes or resources, whatever, how often they're coming up, gives you a broad overview of what the data looks like, whether it's patterns within a participant or across participants. So in that table that I have on the right here, which it was not purple in my article, I was having fun here, but we have both. So this table contains a lot of information. One, it's telling you what the resource is over here on the left column. It's giving you the definition that I used when I was coding them, so you know what I was looking for in student behavior, in their words, whatever it was, depending on the resource, that if they were doing those things, then I would tag it with that particular resource. And then I tell you in the right column how many times that happened in my data. And this is across all participants. And so it varies, even within this table. The one with the least amount of frequency popping up in my data was 6 for the visually represent data, but then consider experimental context came up 19 times, which, yes, that was more than once in all of my interviews because I had 16 hours of interviews, so it was happening everywhere. So this is one way we can present data, our qualitative data, to readers to give a pretty quick overview. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance that this table can't capture because it's a table. I can only put so much information into it, but it does give you a pretty good overview of, oh, so this resource was apparently really important to the students in this study. This one, maybe not so much, or maybe to specific students, because I don't say here it was happening with particular people or not. In my case, it wasn't, but it was happening less often. So it does give you a way to kind of get an idea of what patterns are happening in the data for these codes. It's not the only thing I give you, so I give you this table, but then my first half of my results section is talking about the what does visually represent data mean? Like, I give you the definition, but what we do in qualitative research is, especially when we're doing this kind of identification of codes or themes, whatever it is, we then will go describe in detail each theme. Usually, if it's not a subhead itself, it'll be, a paragraph within a section, whatever makes sense for what the researchers are presenting, how much they have to present. But they will always, usually, should, for good qualitative research, show you quotations from participants that exemplify that code or theme. Now, I didn't include it here, but if you want to go look back at the reading from week 2, you can go see when I do this for each individual code that I talk about. For qualitative research, this is another way we show our data. So because our data isn't necessarily, test scores that we can give you graphs and figures, I can show you my data by giving you frequencies of my codes. So that's one way I can show you my data. The other way is showing you the actual data, so I can give you the transcript. Or if often in research that has things that participants may make during interviews or during observations, or they're collecting student work, whatever they're doing, they might present examples of that work itself. So it isn't always just quotations from participants. It is whatever makes sense to that research to exemplify it. So it could be examples of student work. It could be pictures of something happening in the moment. Whatever makes sense for them to present it, but the data gets presented in that kind of almost I'd say raw form. It's not a score, it's the actual probably video or artifact that the researchers themselves were analyzing when they were doing their analysis. So it is kind of, in a way, the raw data where you usually don't necessarily in quantitative research see the individual answers to each question. You get kind of the overall test score that comes out of that. So data is presented a little differently in terms of qualitative research. Now, the other way that data is presented differently in research, qualitative research specifically, relates to that second goal that I had, that I wanted to showcase how the resources interact during that process of interacting with anomalous data. So the tables and the sections talking about resources that I did for kind of answering or doing that first goal, they're descriptive, but they don't really show how the resources interacted. They tell you what they are and what they look like, how often they happened, but they don't tell you anything about how they were interacting together. And that's not a bad thing. It's a feature of how I presented that information. I was talking about each of them individually, so the formatting of that section just didn't suit making that connection piece without it being so chaotic that you'd have no clue what I was talking about. So part of it was just good writing structure to make it understandable for the reader. The other thing that often we use in qualitative research are case studies, which we've read a couple papers already that used case studies. You will definitely encounter them again later, and my study used case study as well. And essentially with a case, we can use it as almost, well, it is an extended example of something that's happening in the data that we're trying to convey. Usually we use these cases to convey dynamic processes. So things that happen over time, they change potentially many ways over time. So we use cases to kind of capture that process that just describing my codes, my themes, my resources wouldn't tell you at all. So in the case of my article, to answer that question, the best way to say that how are these resources interacting, how are the students using these resources, was to just show you a student using these resources and not just give you the transcript and not say anything else, but guide the reader through with my explanation and analysis so that you can see how I am interpreting the data. So why did I pick Michelle as my focal case? And if you didn't remember who I picked, that's who was the focal case in my article. And I will say real quick, you might see this word focal related to the word focus. It just means that's the case that I chose for my article. This often happens when articles only have one case. Single case studies are a thing. Sometimes it's not necessarily a goal of the research to have one case, just potentially more of a limit of space. I'll talk about that in a second. So besides that reason, why did I pick Michelle as my focal case? A big component of it was novelty slash just being an interesting case in general. And yes, researchers use interesting novelty, surprising reactions to research to help guide their case selection. Because usually if it is piquing the researcher's interest, often something in there is happening that once they dig into their analysis even more, it brings out those really deep answers that they're looking for their research. So in my case, Michelle had a different interpretation of what caused the anomaly for the data she was working with compared to everybody else who I interviewed that worked with that same data. So she was novel. She had a very different interpretation from everybody else. Now, important to my work was not necessarily that she had a different interpretation, but that her having a different interpretation really highlighted how the explanation she developed, that interpretation of what caused the anomaly, impacted the choice that she made when I asked her what she wanted to do with the anomaly. She made a different choice from everybody else because she had a different explanation. So it wasn't necessarily that she was doing something completely different from everybody else, so much as that pattern was pervasive across my data. That explanation developed impacts the choice students make. But when the student makes an explanation that I wasn't expecting her to make, it really highlighted that connection of, yeah, because she has this interpretation, I can see her logic for why she chose the response, even though I had a different interpretation, and so I would have made a different choice. So for this case, Michelle really, by being novel, ended up really highlighting a pattern that was actually happening throughout my data. So it wasn't that she was just a one-off in terms of completely being different from everybody else. It was just that she took a different perspective, but used the same kind of logic pattern as everybody else. So I used it to highlight that pattern, which is what I just said here. So, and this can be often why researchers pick things, because novelty can make finding that nuance in the pattern more interesting. Sometimes researchers also take this perspective, and in the case I also took this perspective because, at least I will say in science education research, sometimes the research can focus on how to get students to the correct answer, uh, and not really taking into account or giving space for how the student came to their answer. That perspective is becoming less frequent now because we are realizing the more we think about or change the ways we think about how learning works and how people approach problems, taking a more nuanced approach actually helps you better understand what's happening. So part of me doing Michelle as my focal case was to highlight to Michelle, this seemed like a correct answer. It wasn't that she was just guessing, like she had a logic to her answer. She developed an interpretation. Like the case itself has multiple instances of transcript to highlight how she's interacting with the data. So it's not that she just gives this explanation and I don't know why. Like I can see how her explanation is developing. Did she technically not come to the expected answer because I knew what was happening? Sure. But she didn't have that knowledge. She didn't know what the expected answer was going to be. And so she was working off of the knowledge and experiences that she had. And when it comes to science education research, recognizing that helps you really figure out where students are getting stuck on things, why they've made particular interpretations, and then you can help them get to where they need to go. So part of my motive in using Michelle as my case was to highlight that there is nuance happening in the whole process. We can't just look at the ultimate decision that happens because that is influenced by everything that came before it. So you might be wondering, why did I only have one case? In my context, it was mostly a space limit. So the article that I wrote and was submitting to the journal, that had a particular word limit. So I actually, in my thesis, had two cases, but because of the article's word limit, I couldn't include both cases. And so I made an executive decision to pick Michelle because of the two cases. I was really drawn to that novelty of her case, and it really conveyed the uh, argument I was trying to make that the explanation students generate is already a complex process, but the result of that influences that next step of what do you do with the data now that you've figured out why you think it went wrong or not. And in my case, in my research, for this article, I could technically present my findings without necessarily needing to use several cases. So I didn't do a case comparison in the traditional sense of here's case 1, 2, and 3, and I'm going to show you each case, and then I compare them afterwards. There are places that do that, and depending on your research question, that might actually be really important. But for me, I wanted to really highlight that pattern, and while I could give you several cases that have that pattern going on in different contexts, I could also do it with one case, and so I picked the novel one. And I didn't technically not compare to the rest of my data, I should state that. I did have that section at the end of the results that was talking about how Michelle's case relates to the rest of my data. So I didn't not compare, I just de-emphasized that component compared to the case, mainly for space purposes. Broadly speaking though, the approach that you take in terms of do you pick one case, do you have multiple cases, it really depends on what your analysis goals are. So you might not need cases at all if you just want to highlight themes across your data. You don't really need a case for that because I just need to see, okay, what were the themes that you found? How were you identifying them? But that is more, you should just show me quotes that exemplify that theme. I don't need a case to tell me that. Or you may only want to use cases, and probably several if you're going to just use cases, if you're trying to capture the dynamics of an experience or process. So if I had slightly different goals, I might have done a bunch of cases rather than having that first section of here are the different resources I found, if that made sense for what I was doing. Maybe I wanted to look at different ways students approached anomalous data. Maybe I wasn't going to code as resources and I just wanted to look at the process. Then I could do multiple cases because I would want to show you multiple different ways students went through the process. So it really depends on your research questions, your approach to your research, in what are going to be the most appropriate ways to present your data. So putting all of this in context, thinking about the readings we've had thus far and what you're going to encounter in the future, whether it's for your research proposal at the end of the semester or you doing your own finding research in your life after this class, when you're looking at qualitative work, researchers have to select data most of the time. So it's either the quotes that they include, the cases they select, they're going to be making choices. They're presenting specific data in their results because it's important for some reason, and they should be telling us that reason in their interpretation of the data. So we might potentially, it could happen at the end of the methods if they're telling us about case selection. They should tell us somewhere in their paper why they have picked what they've picked in terms of data. But we should see justification for why things are selected, especially when it comes to cases. When it's quotes, usually it's self-explanatory. If the quote didn't make sense for the theme that you told me it was, then I'm going to question your quality of research. So often they are going to pick quotes in that sense for, I would say, almost intuitive understanding by the researcher, or by the reader, where the reader is going to read that quote and based on, the context of the theme that you told them it fits in, it should fit. And if it doesn't, it might, usually that would get caught in peer review if it didn't. When it comes to cases, it's a little bit more of a complex decision-making process, and so they should actually be telling us why they picked specific cases. And sometimes that reason can be that it was interesting, or it was an unexpected finding, or it was a novel finding compared to the rest of the data. All of these are acceptable answers, though obviously the degree of explanation should be more than just, it was interesting. Like, it should be something along the lines of, it was interesting because XYZ was different than everything else, or they took a different perspective, or whatever makes it interesting, unexpected, or novel. They should tell us that specifically. And if they're not, it's probably going to impact how we read their article because we're going to probably not know why they selected the case, so we won't necessarily know what we're looking for when we read the case, but also we might want to be a little bit critical of their results if they can't tell us why they're doing major research decisions in their article. I might question the quality of their work a little bit. It doesn't mean I necessarily have to throw it out, but I might not you should never take one study as the end all be all for something. You should always look for as many studies as you can find, but if I have a handful of studies, I might not weight that one as much when I'm talking about it in a paper or trying to use research to make a decision if I can't trust the quality of that research as much. So if you are reading something and you can't find why they're doing something and you've really searched for it, not in their methods, not in their results, not in their discussion, I might question a little bit the quality of that paper. And it could just be a feature of not great writing, but these are also things that the reviewers are supposed to catch in the peer review process, so I might question the quality of the research if it wasn't even caught there. Because people are human, and sometimes the reviewers may not be as experienced with the research they're reviewing. That happens sometimes. So there are a lot of things that can go into the process of making me question some research. But when it comes to qualitative research, if they have cases and they aren't telling me clearly why they've picked cases, I would be a little concerned. And I want to kind of re-emphasize and also take kind of a big looking at research as a whole. When we think about qualitative and quantitative data, qualitative research and data takes a different scope or perspective than quantitative. So we can think about this in a way where qualitative really goes in depth with whatever work it's looking at, Often this means you have less participants, but you have more rich data sources, so interviews, video recordings, things like that. Whereas quantitative goes for more breadth. So usually you have a lot more participants, but you're getting very specific data points from them. So you're getting that one measure that you gave them. So a lot could go into their answers on that measure, but if I don't do something to get that kind of data, I can only say so much about why they are scoring the way they're scoring on the measure. Whereas with qualitative research, I'm getting a lot of data, but I'm getting it from less people. So I can't necessarily generalize my finding from 6 students to every student who is in an inquiry-based science lab. That would be not very ethical of me to say that this is happening everywhere. Uh, I can say, though, that based on how I am looking at how people use resources, there were consistent patterns that suggest, with my work and connecting to research outside of my work, part of what the discussion section is for, that there seems to be, you know, people use knowledge resources to help them make decisions and do things, interpret data, make sense of things happening in the world. That my study, while it may be from 6 people, is contributing to a larger body of work that is looking at that. So qualitative does a lot of putting research in the specific study in the scope of the research that has happened. Not that quantitative doesn't do that, but I think qualitative often does that more because we need that scope factor that we can't necessarily do with the study ourselves, but we can do it by connecting to previous research. Whereas with quantitative, you can get pretty big scope if you have a lot of participants. I mean, some studies are national, so that's a lot of scope. So it's not that one is better than the other, and in a way, I think this highlights that you do need the complement of qualitative and quantitative because they're both getting different perspectives of data. And so they yield different information. So it's not that one's better than the other. I mean, I'm a qualitative researcher, but I wouldn't say it's better than quantitative. It just answers questions in different ways. So all of this to say, consider research as a place that has multiple different perspectives that you can consider when you're looking at stuff. You don't have to stick to one kind of research, one form of research. And I would actually say you shouldn't because you can get a lot of rich information by looking at different perspectives compared to just sticking with quantitative or qualitative or just looking at interview studies or things like that. So it's good to be able to synthesize across a lot of different research because you get a lot more perspective when you do that.